Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie sehr herzlich willkommen heißen zum ersten Abend des Schweizerischen Instituts für Auslandforschung in diesem Frühling. Nach einem lebendig spannenden Herbstsemester steigen wir wieder tatendurstig ein und dies gleich mit einem Höhepunkt. Ganz besonders herzlich darf ich unseren heutigen Speaker willkommen heißen, Herrn Professor Dr. Ivan Krastev. Dear Ivan, we are very happy and honored to have you here in the hall where Winston Churchill in 1946 gave his famous speech, "Let Europe Rise." The timing, oppressive as it is, could not be more appropriate. This said, we are in the midst of the greatest political crisis for Europe since the end of World War II. Things are happening before our eyes, which we did not think to be possible even a few weeks ago. The threat was there, but as it came into reality beginning on February 24th, we were shocked and also ashamed that this still could happen on our continent. The bad news is there is already now an immense suffering among the people and the population of Ukraine. And for the time being, we have all reasons to fear that the dictator in the Kremlin will go even further. How far? The fact already that nobody really can answer this question is a terrible menace in itself. One good thing, however, is this. For the first time in many years, there is a strong and determined reunification within the Western Front. May it last. An enemy who succeeded for decades to lie and to deceive has suddenly found a fierce answer. It is the answer of freedom against terror and ruthless imperialism. I'm very proud that we have the opportunity to listen to Professor Krastev. Ivan Krastev, born 1965 in Lukovic, Bulgaria, is one of the foremost intellectuals of our times. He is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, as well as the permanent fellow at the Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen in Vienna. He chairs or chaired other important institutions and is at the same time a prolific writer with books like Democracy Disrupted, 2014, After Europe, 2017, or Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic, 2020. He writes and publishes also in important newspapers like the New York Times or the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. Recently, for example, on February 4th, with Putin, Europe fears all motives, and on February 27th, we are all living in Vladimir Putin's world now. This is the proof. After Professor Krastev's conference of about 30 minutes, you all have, of course, as always, the opportunity to discuss and ask questions. Please seize this special opportunity. I think we will remember it for the rest of our lives. Dear Ivan, thanks again. We are very excited. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. If I was as good as the introduction was, of course, it was going to be great. But for me, it's also not just any lecture that you're giving these days. Most of the cities that are now attacked in Ukraine, I have been visiting. You have friends. Interestingly enough, they don't want to leave. On the other side, I have Russian friends that try to leave the country. And they also discover a new reality, that when they cross the borders, regardless of the fact that they have been signing against the war, they are perceived as Russians. I'm saying this because the change, in my view, is so incredible that probably is going to take time to understand what is exactly happening. I'm starting with the most obvious. Certain period of European history that started with the unification of Germany is ending with the violent partition of Ukraine. For my generation, I was 25 in 1990. Basically, this was the period that we believe is going to be the future as a whole. And now we're asking questions, what is going to happen next? And I'll start with this end of the post-Cold War order, because it might be quite important to understand what we have lost before trying to see what is going to happen next. British-American historian Tony Judd wrote, might be one of the best histories of Europe after 1945 and call it post-war. And for his post-war has two different meanings. One, that this Europe was very much based on the shared legacies and memories of the World War II, which, by the way, was shared both by the West and the East, including Russia. But secondly, post-war means that Europe was living in the world in which we all were convinced that major war is not possible in Europe anymore. We knew that it's possible in the world. We have been people dying in Syria and other places, but we believe that Europe is different. And I do believe both of these assumptions are not true anymore. One is that the first meaning of post-war was that we all believe that in the exceptional nature of the Nazis period. So the word Nazi, the idea was that should be used very carefully in order for this legacy to work. When you see the Russian president declaring that he's fighting Nazis in Ukraine and he's destroying the Ukrainian cities in the way they have been destroyed in the 1940s, you understand that this moral pillar is destroyed. If anybody that you dislike, you can call Nazi. If any war that basically want to start, you can justify on the basis of this. Paradoxically, it means that we have destroyed this very important moral fundament in which we have been all agreeing, even in the days of the Cold War. And secondly, this is one of those tragic ironies that only history can make. I'm Bulgarian. I have been probably seen more Soviet films about the wars than all of you taken together. And there is a certain type of a culture of memory that was coming from this period, and this was based on the fact that Soviet Union was really critically important for defeating Nazi Germany. 27 million people have died. President Putin tried to privatize this, to forget the fact that there were Ukrainians dying, Belarusians dying. Every third citizens of Belarus have been destroyed during the war. And then suddenly, what is happening in these films, these classical moments of heroism, and these moments of heroism you see reenacted, but not on the Russian side, but on the Ukrainian side. Of those who basically have been seeing these films, you know the famous story of the Brest fortress, which was defending itself for 45 days after the war started. So Hitler's army have been in front of Moscow, and this kind of a piece of land was defending itself without the idea that they can survive or they can going to win. And this was one of the key moments in all this culture of the World War II. And then suddenly, when I was seeing the video conversations about the Ukrainian border guards on the Snake Island, that have been asking to surrender with basically no any options that they can prevail in saying to the Russians, basically go home, you understand that some important cultural change is happening. This is something that was common and we agreed is not there anymore. Second, about post-war. European Council on Foreign Relations, to which I belong, we did a survey just in the beginning of February, and majority of every European country that we have been polling, majority of people said that they expect that there's going to be a war till the end of the year. So the war happened. This is not a war is impossible in Europe anymore. What shocked me most is that the younger generation, people in their 20s, for the first time in their life discovered that there are nuclear weapons in the world. The way they started asking about nuclear weapons, and I have a 20-year-old daughter, was shocking for me. Because suddenly we understand what we have been losing. Because for this post-Cold War period, the nukes were there, but we never talked about them. In a certain way, they were there and not there at the same time. And suddenly, on the third day of the war, you have the president of the Russian Federation saying, be prepared that I'm ready to do anything. Nothing is off the table. I'm saying this because, in my view, this is a very important thing, and we are not going to understand also what is going on if we're not going to understand what kind of assumptions on which European projects have been based, have been very strongly questioned by this crisis. The first is, in Europe, we managed to convince ourselves that military power doesn't matter. And we have seen the limits of military power. We have seen Americans in Iraq. We have seen Americans in Afghanistan. And we're saying investing in defense does not make sense because military power cannot buy much. And then suddenly you understand that military power matters, particularly if you don't have it. We can talk a lot about this, but in one day, President Putin managed to kill, as one colleague nicely put it, the Swedish neutrality and German pacifism. In one day, you can see basically the left-wing government of Germany asking for such type of an investment in defense capabilities that nobody expected it's going to happen. And I was in Berlin 2 weeks before it, talking to the German government. Believe me, 2 weeks, even for them, this was impossible to imagine that they're going to do it. They were very ready to close Nord Stream 2, but for them, militarization, weapons were things that they see was so much against German identity that they were not ready to do it. And they did it because the public opinion asked for it. For the first time, basically, you have the majority of Germans supporting arming the Ukrainians. So anybody who has been following the German debate knows for what kind of a radical change we're talking about. The second thing was about economic interdependence. And I know that most of the people in this room know about this much more than I do. But one of the most important foundation on which European idea of the security was based was that the more we trade with each other, the less is the risk of starting a war. And it was true. And by the way, even Nord Stream 2 was made as a security project, not simply as a business project. The idea is that Russians are going so much to depend on us buying their gas that they're not going to have an incentive to start basically pressure and war. But in the last days, what we are seeing is that, in fact, interdependency can be also a source of insecurity, total vulnerability. The total energy dependence of some of the European countries on the Russian gas makes it very difficult for them to take certain foreign policy actions. Also, we understand that economic interdependency can be weaponized on all sides. Not only basically the decision and talking to experts, it took 48 hours for the Western governments to escalate sanctions on Russia. For the same type of escalation in the case of Iran, it took 2 years. We are talking about totally different situation in which suddenly we are in a major economic warfare and everything that have been connecting us have been weaponized. Movement of people, movement of ideas, movements of goods, movements of finance. According to the Sergei Guriev, one of the leading Russian economists living now in Paris, the general effect of the Western sanctions on the Russian economy for these years is going to be between 7 and 9% of the GDP. This is around twice more than the effect of the pandemic on the Russian economy. So the scale of what is happening, in my view, is something, because we see it, we emotionally go through this, but this is the scale which is, in a certain way, absolutely amazing, and I'm not sure to what extent we're ready to do with this. And this is quite important, because even if there's going to be a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine, if there's going to be some ceasefire, it does not mean that this type of sanctions are going to be reversed automatically, particularly when it comes to the American sanctions, and keeping in mind that also the American Congress should decide on many of them. You can imagine that some of the sanctions are going to stay for a long time. So we're in a totally different type of reality, and I can imagine that if you have a company, this is totally changing the way you see what is possible, what is not possible. And the third is European Union was very much socialized in the idea that what really matters is the soft power. The attractiveness of your political model, of your social model, the fact that others want to be like you. And now we're much more entering a period in which it's not soft power, but the resilience that matters. This is not so much what kind of a damage you can do to the others. The problem is how much pain you're ready to endure in order to basically protect your way of life, basically your positions. So saying all this, I want to go back to history, because going in all these kind of discussions, always comes the questions, what we got wrong. Why we're surprised, not so much but by what happened in the last weeks, but what happened in the last years. Why we're not prepared to see what is happening in Russia, what is happening basically to all of us. And I'll start with one argument. I do believe our major intellectual mistake is that we started with the assumptions that the end of communism, the end of the Cold War, and the end of Soviet Union, this is just the same thing, but three different words. But they were not. And by the way, they didn't happen at the same time. The communism ended almost in 1989, and if you're going to see when Fukuyama wrote his famous article about the end of history, it was the spring of 1989. And then the end of Cold War ended somewhere in the 1990s, when East European countries basically get out of the Soviet sphere of influence. The interesting story was that when we are talking about the post-Cold War European order, we're forgetting the most obvious fact. It was not Russia that was the Western partner for this. It was Soviet Union. And paradoxically, President Gorbachev has a very special reasons to believe while the Soviet Union can benefit of entering this type of a liberal order. And the most important thing for him is that he believes that through entering this international order, he can preserve the Soviet Union as a post-communist state. And to be honest, he was very convincing, and most of the American leaders of this period was sharing his assumptions that this integration of the Soviet Union can be a risk, not an opportunity. It was American President George Bush Sr. who went to Kiev and said to the Ukrainians, don't get independence. The major fear was what is going to happen with the Soviet nuclear weapons, which have been in 4 different republics. I'm saying all this because many of the Soviet leaders of this period really hoped that entering the liberal order is going to allow them to keep the Soviet Union as a post-communist state, and it failed. And it failed not because the West was trying to disintegrate Soviet Union, but because the different republics and the people living there decided that they want to go on a way of their own. And this was a process that cannot be reversed, and nobody, nevertheless, of what kind of a geopolitical interest articulates, basically can stop this process. I'm saying this because in a certain way, why we have been talking about what was happening in the last 30 years, mostly in terms of the democratization, there was a very important period of disintegration of a classical empire and decolonization that was going on the post-Soviet space. That was critically important to understand what is happening now. We were not ready to see this because, honestly speaking, in none of the periods of these 30 years, any of the Russian leader was ready to live with the fact that particularly the Slavic republics are going to be sovereign in the state. For example, Poland is sovereign, or Czech Republic. The idea of having a special relationship and keeping special relations was so strong that in a certain way, even in the Yeltsin period when Russia was very much weak, the idea that Ukraine or Belarus can go on their own was something that was not taken particularly serious, and even very kind of a liberal people like Mr. Chubais was talking about Russia as a liberal empire that is going to keep its post-Soviet space influence. I'm saying this because all this changed dramatically with the color revolutions in 2004. It was a democratic revolution, but it was also a major assertion of a Ukrainian identity being different than the Russian one. And for President Putin, the color revolution of 2004 was like 9/11 for the United States. He basically see all his projects threatened on two levels. One, on the level of the regime. Could the same happen in Russia with people on the streets? But secondly, had the feeling that he's starting to lose the post-Soviet space. But we still never believed that nevertheless that this sentiment existed, Russian leadership, and in this case basically President Putin, was going to be ready to try to recolonize the lands that he perceived as part of historic Russia. It was just in 2002 when they found in the archive a very important speech that Soviet leader Khrushchev gave on January 8, 1962. Back then he said that Soviet Union is so much kind of in a losing position with respect to the United States that the only thing that Soviet leaders should do is to take the initiative in order to change basically the balance. I do believe that if we go to the archives, probably we're going to see a similar speech that President Putin has done somewhere in the beginning of 2014. After Yanukovych basically was removed from power. And then we entered in a period in which we all the time was trying to tell ourselves that this is in limits, that it is never going to develop very much. But it was the Crimean effect that very much explains what we're seeing today. If you're going to read most of the analysis, and yesterday the leader of the American intelligence community was testifying in the Congress, and he said, basically, President Putin expected to get Kiev in 2 days. And the question is why? And one of the things that I have learned for all these years, and I have met President Putin several times, is the following. We always believe that what he is saying is much more deceptive, that it's very cynical, that we should read between the lines. Particularly in the last years, he should be read very literally. He's saying that he will do what he does. And when in July he wrote this famous essay that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, and that he's never going to allow the anti-Russia Ukraine, this is exactly what he did. He did it, but he did it on the totally wrong assumptions that Ukrainians also share his view that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. Only sharing these assumptions and believing that Ukraine is the larger version of Crimea, you can imagine that in 2 days you're going to get Kiev. He really became something that I do believe is the most dangerous in politics, to become the victim of your own propaganda. To start to believe that you are going to be met as a liberator. To believe that there is a kind of a colonial pro-Western elite, and the moment this pro-Western elite is going to be removed, people are going to be on your side, and basically historic Russia is going to be back. And what is happening is that something that was meant to be a special operations turned to be a major war that is destroying Russian cities that in many of them you have the majority of people have been Russian speakers. I cannot imagine if you go back, this is not a crime, this is a sin. For a country that was destroyed by a civil war just a century ago, to go basically and doing this again, all these cities that have been destroyed during the World War II, you're going and destroying absolutely the same way. And I'm saying this because this essay also gave me an opportunity to give you some of my personal reading of part of the motivation and basically the way the Russian president is seeing the world. And this time, I really believe it is a Putin's war. It's not Russia's war. The Russian population was more surprised than us that the war started because he didn't prepare them for this. President Putin spent most of the time when Soviet society was changing outside of Soviet Union. For those of you who have the experience of being outside of your own country when the country changes in a dramatic way, you know how confusing is everything. He was in East Germany. And also, the only thing that he experienced personally was the unification of Germany and the incredible enthusiasm of the people. So on the first page of the essay that I'm talking about, he's talking about the wall that recently have been built between Russia and Ukraine. So in his own mind, he's there to destroy this war. And basically for him, at least Eastern Ukraine was the analogy of East Germany. This was the model through which you are seeing what is happening. And this is why part of the crisis in which we are, that we are all living in the Putin's world. But Putin's world has collapsed in the eyes of the Putin himself. Because these same Ukrainians that you expect to meet you as a liberator are not simply fighting you on the streets, but you have all these videos of ordinary people on the streets going to the Russian soldiers and saying, "What are you doing here? Go back home." I do believe that from this point of view, we're in a very dramatic situation because it's not simply that one or the other plan has collapsed, but you have a leadership, by the way, also on our side, that is constantly surprised by what we are seeing happening. And then, and this is where I go basically to try to make my next argument is, what kind of a relations Russia and Europe can have in this moment? When I was coming here, and basically we had the title before the war started, for me, post-America means something very simple. The United States administration has made a very clear decision that Asia is at the center of their interest, and basically they should focus on China. As a result of it, this American administration wanted everything but not a war in Ukraine. And it was very clear that basically President Biden was looking to try to have a certain deal with the Russian leadership that is going to allow the United States to refocus on China, where they do believe that the major kind of a conflict is where they're going to face, not so much in military, but also in economic and other terms. And then this post-American world and Europe has been very much changed. America is back, and America is back in a very big way. There are going to be American troops in Poland. There are going to be American troops in the Baltic republics. And they should be, because all these countries feel totally insecure. But what is going to happen for Russia? Russians have been preparing for starting a war. They knew that there are going to be sanctions, but they firmly believed that two types of sanctions are going to be impossible. One was sanctioning of the national bank. As a result of it preparing for the sanctions, Russian government did everything to increase as much as possible the external hard currency reserve. During the COVID, while all of our governments were spending as if we were in a war, Russian hard currency reserves have been increased by 200 billion. They believe that they're going to have enough money basically to respond in the case of sanctions. What they didn't expect is that basically United States, European government, but also Swiss government have decided basically to to freeze their assets, so they lost in one day 50% of their currency reserves. So in a certain way now in Russia today, you have the following situation. In 1 year, you cannot take more than $10,000 out of your savings. Basically, because of the SWIFT and getting the Russian banks out of this system, your credit card is not going to work. And of course, this is not affecting everybody. Only 10% of the Russian savers has more than $10,000 in their bank accounts. But this is totally changing the life of the urban middle class in Russia that existed there. What is happening with the Western firms, and I hope that not many of you in this room are going to be basically the victim of this, but basically Russian government adopted the following strategy. They said, firms who want to stay, we're going to be very grateful. Those who believe that it's difficult for them to stay, we're advising to give their management to their Russian partners and basically their assets. And those who decided to leave, we are going to look at this as an intentional bankruptcy, which basically means that they are going to nationalize the assets of the companies that decided to leave the country. This is the first big wave of nationalization after the end of the Cold War. This is totally different. And on our side, of course, there are going to be also reciprocal kind of attacks on the Russian assets. On the level of what is going to happen of deglobalization, what is going to happen on other markets, and I'm even not going to touch on energy. Just keep in mind, 70% of all grain that is consumed in Egypt is coming from Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are the two biggest exporters of grain. So you're going to have a food crisis, you're going to have an energy crisis. So from this point of view, it's not what is going to happen simply in Ukraine or between Russia and Ukraine. We're in a totally different world. First, because, and I do believe rightly, the Western government reached the conclusions that they cannot rely on any type of a business as usual with the Russian government while Putin is still in government. So from this point of view, even if they're going to be ceasefire, the economic war is not going to be over. It's going to change. Probably certain things are going to be softening, but we are entering a period which much more resembles the period about which Churchill was talking back then than about what we remember. And secondly, and I'm going to finish on this, is what it means for Europe. For me, this is quite important because we should try to imagine that the changes in Europe are so big that it's going to take some time, first to understand them, but secondly to sustain them. Because now there is a special moment. Public opinion played an incredible role for what is happening. If it was not for the pressure of the public opinion, the governments are not going to do many things. I was asking some leading European politicians, why did you put Lavrov and Putin on the list? Normally, you're not putting on the sanctions list the heads of states because it assumes that you're going to negotiate. And they said something very simple. If we were not going to put them, our publics were not going to believe us that we're doing anything serious. So in a certain way, this is not this time that governments are trying to convince the publics. It is much more the publics. Secondly, imagine everything that you remember of Europe from the last 10 years, and you're going to see all this changing. First, Europe was not interested in defense spending. Europe was never interested in creating real defense capabilities. This is changing. I'm not excluding that in 1 or 2 years, if situation goes like this, that in Germany you're going to have a serious debate about can Germany also should, together with France, develop and invest in their nuclear capacities, particularly if certain developments in the American politics go in a different way. Secondly, what you know about Eastern Europe, that these are people who do not like migrants. And then you are seeing basically people going with their private cars. And now Poland is probably hosting more refugees from Ukraine than Germany is hosting from Syria. This is a changes that cannot be explained with the decision of one government or different government. People have to understand, in my view, something very fundamental, that the world in which we have been living till yesterday was post-war world. In a paradoxical way, we're living much more in a pre-war world. Probably this war is never going to happen, and I hope it's not going to happen, but you cannot exclude it anymore. And this is why people start to behave in a totally different way. Secondly, even on the level of unity, just yesterday, the Polish government believed that the biggest threat to their sovereignty was Brussels and their regulations and their pushing on constitutional issues. And now they kind of have been forced to realize that Brussels is the only guarantee for Poland remaining a sovereign state. And this is where I basically want to finish. I do believe that there are moments in which the most difficult is not to understand what is going to happen. The most difficult is to understand what has already happened. And if we're going to understand what has already happened, probably this is going to help us to be also slightly more realistic about what can happen. Thank you very much on this.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this brilliant overview. It's somehow desperate, and we might ask then where we find, nevertheless, some signs of hope, and of course also of intellectual honesty to perceive what was happening already 10 years before. I think we lived in a different world then also with our theories, with our assumptions, and this is a really brutal awakening. hardly any of us expected in this way. But I would like to open now the question round, and please, as I said, seize the opportunity. It's absolutely quintessential that we also discuss with each other what's happening here, now, tomorrow, and after tomorrow. So who would like to put the first question? Andreas Breitenstein. We have 2 microphones.
Do you think that Putin can survive this crisis as a president?
The time perspective is very important. How long? Because listen, we all are mortal. This is true even for President Putin. So in a certain way, but the story is that for the moment, there's 3 things that makes the situation so difficult to predict, because one of the important things that has happened and that is very much stabilizing his position is the totally different relations that Russia developed with China. And we should not underestimate to what extent this type of relationship is solidifying, at least on this level, Putin's position. Not because the Chinese are going to give him liquidity, not because the Chinese banks are going to be eager to basically violate, but because anybody who goes against him should be slightly in a position in which the enemies of President Lukashenko were during the Belarusian crisis. There is an outside kind of a support. Secondly, his own circle, and what we know is that he very much narrowed the circle of people that are advising him. It was very clear that none of the people doing economic and financial policy was very much involved in the decisions that have been taken. Today there is a big rumors, which I don't believe that they're true, but they're indicative, that extremely able head of the Russian Central Bank, Mrs. Nibulina, has resigned. I don't believe that this is true, but when you see rumor like this, you know what it is talking about. It is talking about that not simply the big state-owned companies or big state-owned banks like Sberbank and others have been not consulted, but even the head of the central bank was not in this decision-making. So you have a very small circle of people, and all of these people, President Putin organized a show on our televisions that they support the war. All of these people on our sanction lists. All of these people do not feel particularly encouraged to do it. The level of repression in Russia has changed dramatically. If you go to the early Putin period, it was never a democratic state, but for Russian standards, it was quite vegetarian. If you are basically not going to be involved with a direct political activity before 2010, 2011, 2012, particularly during the Medvedev period, you can be critical. You're not risking everything. Today, if you write a Facebook post which is critical about the war effort, and if you're going to say something that everybody knows, that they're conscript soldiers, not professional soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine also, you're risking up to 15 years in prison. I was in Vienna talking to young people who told me why there are no million of Russians protesting the war. Listen, there are Russians who support the war, there are Russians who basically protest the war. But I'm going to ask these people and ask them, are you ready to go on the street when you know that probably you can end up 15 years in prison? The level of risk which people are taking, and this is why we should have a respect for people who are signing declarations, for people who are doing this. They are taking a real risk. These people can lose everything. And this is why it's not easy. On the other side, I really believe that at some point, President Putin cannot hide the war anymore. There is a famous Russian saying that in Russia, the major struggle is between the television set and the refrigerator. Because the television is telling you that it's fine and the refrigerator is telling you it's not fine. And I do believe that this struggle between the television and the refrigerator is going to very much kind of take a dramatic turn. And as a result of it, as I told you, you're going to see the 10% of the Russian population, the traveling middle class, which can see their way of life totally destroyed. Their kids are outside of the country. They're also feeling, I felt very sorry. We have a very close family friend. She was famous theater critic. And she was one of the first who wrote an open letter against Putin. Very difficultly, she got out of Russia. And she said, In Russia, the government treated me as if I'm an agent of Ukraine. When I got out of Russia, I was treated like Russian. And people blame me for what is happening. And I said, welcome to history. Ask the German anti-fascist in France in 1940. So you're going to have also this psychological moment. It is very much about the moral sensibility of our societies to trying to make distinctions. Not everybody in Russia is supporting what is going on, even more. There are people who openly protest taking the risk. And also, you have the distraction of Ukraine and what is going to happen next. I'm one of those who don't believe that Russia is going to occupy the territory of Ukraine as a whole. They simply cannot do it. With the forces which are now in Ukraine, the Russian government cannot do it. What people forget, we're living in a small country, being Bulgarian, I can testify to this, so we don't like very much to think in terms of space.
Me too here.
Yeah. Ukraine is a very big country. Ukraine is twice the size of Germany. Occupying Ukraine, and don't forget, at the moment, Russians are fighting in eastern Ukraine. Welcome them to the western Ukraine, where the anti-Russian sentiments historically are much higher, which is much closer to the Baltic states and to the Polish borders, where also they are not populated with a very strong admirers of Russian president. So from this point of view, you're going to have a situation in which all this is going to freeze for a while, and then at any moment, it can explode either domestically because of the public or because of the elite calculations, but we cannot predict it. This is my story. We cannot predict it. I'm listening to some colleagues. For example, they talk about oligarchs. There are no oligarchs in Russia who are in Russia. Because oligarchy also means autonomous source of power. There is no autonomous source of power. This is not Ukraine in 2014.
Next question, please. Here, the lady.
A couple of days ago, I believe Lavrov said that after the sanctions, commenting on the sanctions, that if Europe and the West in general are not going to want to buy Russian gas anymore, then Russia already knows which business partners to address, and they're surely going to find solutions to cope with this. Whom do you think could Lavrov have in mind in this case?
Listen, I'm sure that in the room there are people who are better prepared to meet your answer. In a short term, it's not going to be easy for the European states to substitute Russian gas. We can talk LNG and so on, but easy substitution is not possible. For the Russians to substitute European markets as a primary market, particularly on their gas, is not going to be easy too. And nevertheless, that of course there are projects that have been developed to China and others. On the gas side, it's going to be difficult. On the oil side, something is happening which is not necessarily in favor of the current situation of the West. Because there is a lot of companies that expect the oil to be put under sanctions, not only by the Americans, which already did it, but by the Europeans, the price goes up. At the same time, the sanctions are not there. So the Russians now are getting $1 billion every day from us. So either we're going to decide that on the oil side we are banning, or we'll say that energy sector is out of the sanctions. But this ambiguity does not work well for the West, because it is pushing the prices up, while at the same time basically is creating a problem. I don't believe that Russia can so easily substitute on gas. On oil, it's not difficult to the extent that there is going to be basically deficit of oil in a global level. So from this point of view, it's not there. But the other thing that is going to happen is that for the Russian government, it's not going to be easy to invest in any type of new of these projects, both financially and technologically. So in order to get new gas and new oil, you should invest in it. And they're not going to be money for investment. And technological sanctions does not work on a short term, but in the long term, they are much more deteriorating. And even if you decide to get Chinese in and so on, it takes time to move from the Western to the Chinese type of technologies. There is a beautiful Russian novel written, by the way, almost a decade ago by Vladimir Sorokin, who is called The Day of the Oprichnik. Oprichnik was the member of the secret police in the time of Ivan Grozny. And it tells the story of the future of Russia as a state which has a kind of a theocracy with a very strong religious, almost middle age type of a flavor. At the same time, armed with the new surveillance technologies, all basically of the goods are Chinese, and there is a major Western wall, so basically they cannot go there. I don't believe that Russian population, but even Russian elites are dreaming about this. And how you're going to solve this, and this is my hope, Russian society is much more westernized that either Russian leaders or even us are ready to see. In the way we have not been ready to recognize in 1990s the long-term legacy and past dependency coming from the Soviet period, now we are underestimating the past dependency coming from these 30 years of modernization. Do you know how many people in Moscow or St. Petersburg have been working for the Western companies? How many of them are basically still there? These people are not going to disappear. And so from this point of view, I do believe that change is possible. I don't believe that the fate of Russia is fixed. The only thing is that unlike Milosevic in the late of 1990s, you're talking about a regime armed with nuclear weapons. So from this point of view, the good news is that as a result of sanctions, President Putin is at the corner. The bad news is that because of the sanctions, he's in the corner.
Exactly. Next question here, please.
Thank you. The story of the Ukrainian resistance cannot be told without mentioning President Zelensky. What options does President Zelensky have? And in your view, what options should he pursue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to answer much more on what options he has. Because basically advising a president who is trying to survive on a day is not an easy, but I understand very much what you're asking. First of all, I should confess that there was the 2 months before the war started, I was one of those very much ambiguous about what Zelensky was doing, because he started war against everybody. He decided basically to arrest the leader of the opposition, Poroshenko. He basically started war on Akhmetov and some of the quite kind of a patriotic-minded oligarchs, which we see now that they're staying on the Ukrainian side. So I didn't understand what he was doing. But this is about politicians, and the Churchill is the great example of them. They are judged on the highest moment. And what he did in the last 12 days was amazing. He first became the embodiment of this new Ukrainian nation. Listen, he was asked by everybody to get out of Kiev. And people were joking with him that he's an artist, that he's a comedian. Probably because he's an artist, he understood better than politicians that he should be in Kiev. And if the Russians were dreaming of killing him 10 days ago, now in my view, they're scared of the possibility to kill him, because they're going to create such a symbolic figure that then nothing is off the table also on the Western side. So from this point of view, Zelensky achieved something very important. When President Putin was talking about denazification 12 days ago, this was a code name of, I'm not going to negotiate with Zelensky. And for reasons that I don't want to discuss, and probably you have read about, there is a personal animosity between the Russian president and Zelensky. He's blaming him for the arrest of Medvedchuk and all this. So this was very personal. Now, Russian side understood that the only meaningful ceasefire that they can sign is with Zelensky. Denazification disappeared. What they're going to negotiate about? The three Russian kind of starting positions are recognition of Crimea, recognition of the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, and then basically neutrality put into a constitution, which means that you are not going to be part of military blocs. Where I do believe Ukrainians are going to push for. They're going to say, okay, if we agree on NATO, this does not include EU. Talking about blocs, so we're talking military blocs. Secondly, if we agree on the republics, we're not going to agree in the administrative borders of the republics, but only territories that have been under the control of the rebels before the war started, which means Mariupol staying Ukrainian. Recognition of Crimea is very difficult for symbolic reasons. But all this can be negotiated at a certain level. The problem is that the insistence for constitutional majority, which the Russians are pushing, is also with the help that they can reduce the symbolic power of Zelensky, because then they're going to be members of parliament who decide to go more hawkish than him, said, we're against any concessions to the Russians. They're going to be concessions for the war to stop. And Zelensky, in my view, knows it very well. But he wants Ukraine to negotiate from the position of strength. And this is why the basic problem is not what they're going to debate, but when. For the moment, Ukraine is resisting successfully, not simply because of the heroic population. And what people are doing is amazing, in fact, if you're going. But also because the Ukrainian army turned to be much better than we expected, and the Russian army turned to be less impressive than we expected. President Putin will try to change this calculation. In order to do this, he'll go to a much more destructive policies with respect to the major population centers. It is true that in the three or four days, the Russian troops were told to minimize civilian casualties. This is true. Now, this, I don't believe, is in the cards anymore. Then they can decide to use some of this psychologically debilitating, I don't mean nuclear, but you have other type of weapons. The biggest problem is, and I do believe Ukrainian government made a very strong point today, we should be afraid also of an accident, of something going wrong, because basically when all this started, for example, the Ukrainians claim, I cannot verify this, but that there is no electricity going to Chernobyl at the moment. Listen, this can become a major disaster, not because the Russians wanted it or because the Ukrainians wanted it. If it happens, the Russian population is going to be as radiated as anybody else. But accidents like this are highly probable in a situation which is getting out of control. And I do believe here is also the Western part. I'm just going to give my last point. The biggest problem for the Russians is when you negotiate with Zelensky, how you negotiate sanctions. It was not Zelensky that is putting sanctions. When and how you negotiate with Americans and Europeans. So in my view, there should be also a second track of negotiations. With the Americans, it's going to be very difficult. The Congress is not going to allow Biden to soften. With Europeans, I do believe certain things can be negotiated, but European public opinion is also not in a mood to give Putin what he believes that he can get. So this is why these two kind of stages of negotiations in a certain way will go probably together.
We are blocked on different levels, absolutely. There was a question over there too. And here, yeah.
You pointed out that Putin now does what he says. So, as the essay you pointed out, and recently he just said that he's going to use the nuclear arms, the weapons, and you mentioned it before as well in passing, but I'm actually wondering, he is in the corner, as you say. How likely do you consider it for him to do that accidental shot?
To be absolutely honest, I'm not somebody on the military side which is credible to talk to you. One of, in my view, of the top American experts on Russia is Fiona Hill, that have been doing basically Russia for all her life from different positions. And her point on this is, and I was also read her, talk to her, she said you should not exclude that in the moment of a kind of a total despair, he can decide to use a nuclear tactical weapons. We're not talking about the Third World War, but basically using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine in order to make a bigger point to the West that nothing is off the table. I do believe that he understands that this is going to destroy him in the world public opinion in the way that you cannot imagine. The guy who is going to use, particularly using nuclear weapons against people that till yesterday you claim is your people, I don't believe it's very likely. Why I'm not excluding it? Because at some point, he cannot simply step back. The drama of the situation is that he cannot win and he cannot lose. So if you're going to ask me about percent, I don't believe it's a high percent. But to say this can never happen, I don't believe it. And I do believe that there is a scenario in which he decides to make this bigger point in order to change the game totally.
You might put off your masks if you want to ask the question. It's easier.
What time horizon would you say is appropriate for us in mind to deal with this war in Ukraine? Do you think it would be 5 years, 10 years, or even more? And what does this mean for the politics in the Western sphere?
I do believe that the biggest challenge for Europe is to sustain the momentum, because we all remember that in the beginning of every crisis, public opinion basically is highly excited about many things. But we also have publics that are not very much in the trade-offs. I remember in Germany when basically the refugee crisis started, and you have the feeling that, oh, basically the Germans are highly excited. 3 months later, you can see that there are different kind of shades of opinions. This is going to happen also in this crisis. There are going to be people who are going to say, push Zelensky to sign anything because we want the war to finish, and also because of the nuclear. Then there are going to be people who are going to say, listen, do you know what you're talking about when you say that till the end of the year, European Union said that we're going to reduce our dependence of energy dependence on Russia by 2/3. This is radical. I was talking yesterday in Vienna to some of the members of the Austrian business community, and believe me, they're very, very much just shattered. Because on one level, Austria is a country which is totally dependent on gas. Most of the electricity is produced by Russian gas. Secondly, when it comes to the banking sector, one of the Austrian banks is probably with the biggest exposure. Raiffeisen International is very much there. So you're going to have one of the interesting things that really make a very strong impression on me, and I could be wrong. Normally when we talk to each other, and if you read our papers, people are saying businesses are running everything, companies are behind any decision, governments are just the puppets of the big business. If you see this decision, both on the Russian side and on our side in the last 2 weeks, business was out of the room. For good reasons, but this was true. Putin obviously even didn't have time to tell Nibulina what is going to happen, but then also on the level of the Western governments, the pressure was so strong, the security challenge, the public opinion, that even the Austrian government, which is very sensitive to their companies, basically said, listen, we should talk tomorrow how you feel. I do believe from this point of view, the biggest problem is to survive. And for me, resilience is the critical word, but for me, resilience means 3 things. First, know your own society. President Putin is failing today because he became the victim of his propaganda. We should be very careful not to become the victim of our own propaganda. We should really know what is happening in our societies. Secondly, resilience is also very much, and for me the biggest fear is that Russian societies will try to do everything to make our life difficult. And I'm not simply talking about possible cyber and stuff, but there is quite a lot of mistrust in our societies. This was seen even during the COVID crisis very much. Weaponizing mistrust is something that basically is easiest that you can do. Make people not to know what is going on. Try people basically not understand anything. I have been very much surprised during the Crimean crisis in 2014 about one thing that President Putin did. When the little green man entered Crimea, he was openly asked by his fellow presidents of Western states, are there Russian troops in Crimea? And he said no. Listen, politicians lie, but when there is deniability possibility. In this case, 2 hours later, they will know the names of the people who are there. This is the world in which we're living. And my story is, why you're lying in a moment in which you know that this is going to become apparent immediately? And following his reaction after that, I understand what is the strategy. And the strategy is the following. You're lying to be called a liar, and then to say, liar like you. What about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? So the idea is to try to say, we all are liars. We all are aggressors. There is no difference between us and them. This is going to be a strategy, and while nobody is going to fall in love with President Putin anymore, people are really ready to believe that there is no good guys. Now they basically trusted Zelensky because he's risking his life. People these days are ready to trust only people who are putting everything on the table. People who are ready to die for something. And this is why for the European leaders to try to keep this consensus, they should try to show that they're ready to lose many things that otherwise go easily for them. And the third, and this is my last point, Europe is also very much exposed to what is going to happen in the United States in the next presidential cycle. And this is not something, we forgot about this, but the Biden's America is not the only America possible. It's not that next America is going to be pro-Russian, but next America is not going to act in accordance with European allies in the way it is acting now. And all this is making so important, and this is why I do believe you better served if Professor Meyer has decided to invite Winston Churchill to talk to you and not me.
Okay, we'll do next time. Please there.
By freezing the assets of the Russian oligarchs, doesn't the West make them far more dependent now on Putin and henceforth make an upheaval coup against Putin more difficult? My second question is, Russia Today was takeoff of all our medias. Was this a good idea?
Both questions are very good question. Let's start with Russia Today. While I'm very strongly for measures against the disinformation coming from Russia, for me Russia Today was not a problem because we know who is behind the television station. It was an official propaganda channel. You know who speaks. So one of the risks in this situation is to try to become like the one you're fighting. And I understand very much that there is a big issue there. This was done also because some of our governments went so close to some of the Russian oligarchs that now basically they're doing everything to show that basically they're breaking the link. The word oligarch is also too big. Listen, they're different people. And some of these different people have been taking very different decisions. They're rich Russians who never went together with Putin. They're rich Russians that have been expelled from the country or left the country. I do believe at this moment nuances matters. But why at the same time this was done? Because at some point, the Russian money that would be having been put in the Western banks and others, we believe that this is the way for the West to influence Russia because you have all these people, their kids are there, they're studying there, and so on. After Crimea, the Russian government went on something that I'm going to say nationalization of the elites. Basically, if you want to be influential in Russia, be sure that you're investing in Russia and also be sure that your kids are back. By the way, these days it's not easy to be a minister in the Russian government if your kids are outside of the country. So from this point of view, there are two types of people. The major pressure we put on people who are not in Russia anyway. But basically, we try to make clear to these people that they should take sides. Taking sides is basically taking also position on what is happening in the war. Some of them did. If it was not for this pressure, I'm sure that none of these people was going to be eager to go and publicly said, it's a criminal war, I want peace and this and that. So from this point of view, the pressure was there, but in my view, it should be slightly more differentiation. No, you should try to understand who is there. Many of these people not simply made their money because of where they have been in the system, but they cannot do what they want exactly because of the way they made their money. And why we are calling them oligarchs, and this is why I always had a problem with the term. Most of these people simply have been high officials working with the Russian government, pretending that they're in private business. There are other people too. There are people who basically decided not to play this game. If we not make a distinctions, then we're going to lose people which otherwise could be very important. And this is why interested what people are doing, what they have been doing for the last 15 or 20 years, at least for me, is very important. It's not about collective guilt. On the other side, and this is on the joking side, probably this is going to slightly reduce the prices on the London real estate, which probably Londoners are going to see as positive move.
Here, please.
Thank you very much. You said before that it's going to be quite hard for negotiations because there's no neutral party, because somehow everyone is conflicted. Historically, Switzerland has always or often taken such a position. Nevertheless, the Swiss government has decided to give up its neutrality in this conflict and take the side of the West. Do you think the benefit, or it was the right call to do so because the benefits of Switzerland backing the sanctions outweighs the losing of having maybe a neutral party who could end a conflict faster?
Listen, I'm the last person to come in this room and to tell what Switzerland should do or not do. But I'm going to make one point, which is, in my view, important from my point of view. Switzerland was neutral because the war was not economic. When there was a military clashes, such an important financial capital like Switzerland can stay neutral. When the war is very much financial and economic, you are too big and too important to be allowed to stay neutral. In my view, this is the reading, and this is not about this and that, because imagine that, I don't know what % of the Russian reserve is in Swiss banks, but this is why suddenly Switzerland is a great power exactly when it comes to the weapon that is now the major weapon of the war. So from this point of view, it was not just the change of the mood of the government and this and that. If it was a normal military conflict, Switzerland could have stayed. But now when the sanctions are becoming the major weapons through which basically the West is fighting Russia, you simply didn't have a luxury, you're too big.
In other words, we are a major partner of Ukraine for the time being, which feels good actually, yes. More questions? Back there.
You mentioned that you believe that Putin believing his own propaganda is the main contributor to the start of this war. What specific evidence made you prefer that thesis for the reason for him going to war over the myriad of other theories that have been advanced to explain his actions? That's my question. Thank you.
One of the things is that basically, and I have been talking, I was in Sochi in October. All this famous essay that we talk about is written personally by the president. Every single word. Secondly, I was watching him. I was watching him when basically he was addressing the population after the recognition of the republics. And secondly, if you go back, and we did it 5 years ago, and trying to see what he was saying that he will do, suddenly you understand better to take him literally. He's very deceptive normally as an intelligence officer when it comes how you're doing things. But he was quite clear about aiming his goals, and even if you go back to the Munich Security Conference 2007, the famous speech, by the way, the level of symbolism is also incredible. He de facto started the war 2 days after the end of the Munich Security Conference, 15 years after his famous speech. The idea is you didn't hear to me, you're going to listen now. I'm going to speak a different language. He started the recognition on the day, which was the day of the Soviet Army. This was the day which basically was celebrating. So he's living, in my view, in a very symbolic world, and in this world you have, and thirdly, he's talking, this time much more to his own people than to us. When you read basically this essay and so on, this makes me believe that this is why he was better to be taken literally. One thing that American strategy of exposure and declassifying the intelligence that they got, that they have been practicing in the 2 months before, 3 months before the war, was that it deprived Putin of 2 things that were very important. Never before. He always acted on the base of surprise. And the American intelligence took surprise out of him. They have been declassifying basically on a daily basis very successfully. As a result of it, for example, you cannot do it. And secondly, because of it, they destroyed his narrative. One of the difficult things for the Russian propaganda, which otherwise is very skillful, is to explain why they're there. And this is why you came with these 2 explanations, which, let's put it mildly, are exaggerated. There was a lot of human suffering happening in Donbass. And listen, I have a sympathy for anybody who suffers. And I don't believe that the fact that people who suffer are not exactly people that you like makes this suffering less precious. But 14,000 people, that is not a genocide. Simply, it's not. Secondly, the second line of justification, that Ukraine is on the edge of getting an atomic bomb, is just a bullshit. This is, of course, Ukraine used to have a nuclear weapons, they returned it, but this is not something that your dirty bomb cannot be hidden like this. This is not things that, so from this point of view, you have a story in which he knows why he's going, he's telling his people why he's going, but he cannot explain to the world. And this was not the case of Crimea, because in Crimea he said, listen to the people on the street. And this is not, in the street of Crimea, not in the streets of Moscow. This is not what we are seeing in the streets of the Ukrainian cities. So this is why we're in a situation in which he's really very much in the corner. And as I said, this is a good situation from the point of view that he didn't achieve what he wanted to achieve. But this makes the situation even more dangerous.
Absolutely. There was this cover of The Economist where he painted himself into the corner, I think 3 weeks ago. Maybe one last question, and then we invite Professor Krastev in a couple of months again. You have to come again. So, who would like to put this question?
You're calling this subscription, yeah?
No, we need somebody else. Andreas, here, yes. This is the last question.
Thank you. Should the European Union make a step towards accepting Ukraine as a member, or rather wait with that and leave it more as a piece of later negotiations that you've been talking about?
Listen, at the moment, you cannot accept Ukraine as a member. European Union is not just a metaphor. It's a single market, it's a political unity. But I do believe by the statement which President von der Leyen made was, because we like to talk that there is no spheres of influence. There are spheres of influence. Belarus is in the Russia sphere of influence. And tomorrow, even if they decide they can put nuclear weapons there, the statement was, we are going to stay and fight for Ukraine. Ukraine is on our side. We care about Ukraine. But in technical terms, to put them in accession talks and negotiations, I find it also in a certain type of ridiculous with respect to what the Ukrainians are doing. So they're going to discuss what? The agricultural policies? But making a clear commitment that Ukrainians are also fighting for us, and we're there with them, and we're standing for them. And this idea of we're not morally neutral, this is not a faraway country. I found this admirable what the president of the commission said, but to believe that this is the beginning of the accession talks, I also believe that this is kind of non-serious with respect to what European Union is.
Okay, thank you so much. Before we finish with our traditional gift to the speaker, I would like to show you what we have in mind for the spring semester. This is the summary. Peter Altmaier, out of office now, but free to speak about Germany. And then, of course, Francis Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong. Professor Büchs, chairwoman of the German Ethics Council. This concerns the pandemic, but also other topics. Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF. This will be probably a morning session here in this room between 9 and 11, because understandably she is extremely busy. But you check our website and there you have all the indications. And Professor Gabriel, philosopher and author, about woke and other things. Then we have the format of the live stream with Katia Centinetta, always brilliant and charming. Constanze Stelzenmüller, Fritz Stern, chair of the Brookings Institution, on the 16th of March. So you switch on your mobile or your iPad. And then on the 28th of June, Professor Marlene Amstad, chairwoman of the board of directors of FINMA, is also in high demand right now. And also, again, 2 evenings at the Literaturhaus with Gesa Schneider, Professor Lea Ippi from Albania, fantastic lady, and Nora Bossong, the same. So the next one actually is Peter Altmaier. Here we see him, and I'd be very happy if you all attend again and put questions. I think this is also a fantastic opportunity. So now the gift, you know, it's always difficult. What should we give you and maybe your family and your wife? And so for your wife, we have also something very nice, which we do not show on the screen, but your gift is shown on the screen, and we just talked about neutral Switzerland. Well, this is actually a little bit ambiguous, because now have a look of what we provided for you. And this is the Swiss Army knife, so-called at its best now, with new functions and skills, and everybody's admiring you in the middle of this bubble. It's not entirely neutral, as you can see. There are certain tools which can hurt, but it is really good for almost everything in life, and especially for the days to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First, for the opportunity. Thank you for the fact being here. Certainly very much for arming Bulgarians, which is always good. And lastly, but not least, I was very much kind of understanding that you have a special Bulgarian policy, because Kristalina Georgieva is a Bulgarian too. So after Germans, we are coming this month as the second most frequent guests of the Institute. Thank you so much.
It was fantastic. It was fantastic, really.